Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story.
Subscribe, like, and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
The house I paid for went to my sister. Not half. Not a shared asset. Not a thanks for everything. Just a gift with a pink bow and my parents' signature on the deed, handed over like a party favor while I sat at the same dining table where, for years, I'd quietly agreed to help keep the lights on and the roof from caving in. I didn't even get a heads up, no conversation, no softening of the blow, not even the courtesy of a polite warning that everything I'd been carrying wasn't going to mean a damn thing when the time came to divvy up the rewards. It didn't start that way, of course. 5 years earlier, it was just supposed to be temporary. That was the word my mother used when she called me out of the blue one evening, voice hushed with the kind of vulnerability that always got under my skin. She said the mortgage payments were starting to feel heavy, that Dad's retirement money hadn't been stretching as far as they thought, that the house was at risk of falling behind. Just until we get our footing again, she said, and I, being the ever-obliging daughter, didn't even hesitate before agreeing. I was doing well at the time, good job, no kids, no major debts. It felt like the right thing to do, and if I'm being honest, a part of me believed it would come back around eventually. That's what family is supposed to do, right? You step up when someone falls short. You give without keeping score. But scorekeeping doesn't start as numbers on a page. It starts in the moments you don't notice you're giving more than you're receiving. It starts in the months that turn into years, in the bills that come directly to your inbox instead of theirs, in the way your sister keeps showing up with excuses instead of rent money while still managing to post vacation selfies from beaches you've never even been to. Ashley, for all her charm and performative helplessness, had never worked a steady job in her life. She bounced from one half-baked career idea to the next: artist, influencer, freelance consultant, whatever the hell that meant, while my parents smiled and told everyone she was just finding her path. Meanwhile, I was funding their path, one automatic payment at a time. I told myself I was helping. I told myself I was keeping the family afloat. I told myself it would balance out in the end. But none of those lies held up when the truth showed up in the form of a signed deed and a smirking announcement over dinner. I'd been invited over for what I thought was a casual meal, some wine, a few laughs, maybe a little catching up. Ashley was glowing in that way she always did when she had news to share, and I figured maybe she was finally pregnant or had landed an actual job. But instead, my mother raised her glass, smiled sweetly, and said, "We have a little surprise for Ashley and Mark." Mark, her fiancé at the time, grinned like he already knew what was coming, and I felt my stomach tighten in that quiet, creeping way it always did before something stupid fell out of my parents' mouths. "We've decided to give them the house," my father added, like he was announcing a weather update and not a decision that cracked something wide open inside my chest. "As a wedding gift." Just like that. No preamble. No acknowledgement of the years I'd been covering that very mortgage. No mention of how many times I'd pulled money from my own savings to cover property taxes, repairs, even that new roof they needed 2 summers ago when a storm tore through the neighborhood and their insurance coverage fell short. I stared at them, waiting for the punchline, but it never came. Just Ashley's wide-eyed grin and my mother's nod of approval as if she'd just handed me a second helping of potato salad and not a betrayal I wouldn't forget for the rest of my life. And when I opened my mouth, not to argue, but just to ask why, my mother leaned over, patted my hand, and said, "You've already got your own place, sweetie. This is their start. You're already established." That was it, the whole justification. I didn't need it, so they gave it to someone who did, conveniently forgetting who had kept it from slipping through their fingers in the first place. I wasn't even angry yet. I was stunned, hollow, shell-shocked in a way that didn't quite register until I looked down at the paper sitting on the table, legal, signed, final. And all I could do was sit there at the dining table, staring at the paperwork I'd basically funded, while they toasted her with champagne. There's a certain kind of peace that only comes when you walk into a place that is entirely your own, a place where every inch of space reflects your choices, your labor, your independence. And not a single corner of it is tied to someone else's expectations or guilt trips. That's exactly what my vacation home was to me, not just a property or an investment or some vanity purchase to show off on holidays, but a sanctuary I'd carved out for myself after years of living in the shadow of everyone else's mess. It wasn't big or fancy, just a cozy little cottage by the lake, quiet and tucked away from the world, with creaky floorboards and chipped paint in places, but it was mine. Mine in a way that nothing in that other house ever was, despite the fact that I'd paid for most of it. After the dinner where my parents handed the keys to my sister like some kind of reality show prize, I needed space more than I'd ever needed anything. So I packed a few bags, left the city behind, and drove out to the vacation home without telling anyone. The moment I stepped through the door, I felt the kind of relief that can't be described. It wasn't just physical distance from them, it was emotional silence. A break from the constant hum of resentment and polite betrayal that had been building inside me for years. I spent my first week there doing absolutely nothing productive, and I mean that in the best way. I slept late. I drank wine on the porch. I read books I hadn't touched in years. I didn't answer phone calls. I didn't check emails. I let the world fall away like it had nothing left to say to me, and for a while, that felt like enough. Then, 2 months later, the peace cracked. It started with a casual phone call from my mother, her voice light and sweet in that way she used when she wanted something but hadn't yet decided how to manipulate you into giving it to her. She asked how I was doing, complimented the photos I'd posted online of the lake view and the sunsets, mentioned how much she and Dad missed me, and then, almost as if it were an afterthought, said, "Your father and I have been thinking. It might be good for us to have a little break, too." I didn't say anything. I just waited. She continued, "We've been considering downsizing, maybe selling the house eventually, since Ashley and Mark are settled in now. And with everything going on, it might be nice to stay somewhere quiet for a few months. Just until we figure things out." I knew exactly what she was building toward before she even got to it. And sure enough, she said it, soft and casual, as if she were asking to borrow a casserole dish instead of my last shred of peace. "Would it be all right if we stayed at your vacation home for a while? Just until things stabilize. It's not like you're using it all the time, right?" And that's when I realized that nothing had changed, not really. Even after giving away the house I paid for, even after seeing how little regard they had for my contributions, they still assumed I'd be the safety net. They still expected that no matter what they did, I'd keep opening doors for them without question. I took a deep breath, measured my tone, and said, "I don't think that's a good idea right now." I kept it simple, firm, polite, but final. I didn't yell. I didn't explain. I didn't remind her of what they'd done. I just said no, and for once, I didn't cushion it with apologies. Because here's the thing, have you ever hit a point where saying no wasn't revenge, it was self-respect? Have you ever had someone act shocked when you stopped bleeding for them? That was the look I imagined on her face as silence filled the line. Not anger. Not sadness. Just surprise. Like she genuinely couldn't believe I wasn't going to carry them one more time. She recovered quickly, of course. My mother always knew how to mask her disappointment behind veiled pleasantries. "Well," she said with a clipped voice, "I suppose family means different things to different people." That was her version of a slap in the face, passive, pointed, and utterly predictable. But what she didn't realize was that she was right. It did mean something different to me now. And I was finally okay with that. Guilt has never walked straight through the front door in my family. It always came dressed up in concern, wrapped in soft voices and long pauses, delivered through messages that sounded just shy of reasonable but carried the unmistakable stench of manipulation beneath every carefully chosen word. And once I told my parents they couldn't stay at the vacation home, once I finally dared to draw a line in the sand that didn't immediately get washed away by obligation, the machine kicked into motion exactly the way I knew it would. Not in rage or confrontation. My mother would never risk looking ungracious or direct, but in small, precise doses of guilt disguised as affection. It started with the voicemails, the kind that sounded innocent to someone who didn't know better, filled with hesitant pauses and sighs that said more than any sentence could. "Hi, honey," my mother's voice would begin, always too bright, like she was smiling through disappointment. Just checking in again. Your father and I were talking about how quiet the house feels lately. Ashley and Mark are just so busy with their own lives. Sometimes we just miss having a warm place to feel connected. Then silence, just long enough to sting, followed by her favorite line, the one she always used when she was hoping I'd bend. Anyway, hope everything's going well. Love you. The first couple of messages I ignored. I didn't respond, didn't bite, didn't let the hook sink in. But then the frequency picked up, 3 calls in 1 week, then another voicemail from my father, which was rare enough on its own to make me sit up straighter just hearing his voice on my phone. His message was awkward and stilted, the way it always was when my mother was standing nearby feeding him lines to say, "Hey kiddo, just wanted to talk. Nothing serious. Maybe we could get lunch sometime. I miss you." That one nearly got me. Not because I believed it, but because I remembered the man he used to be before he faded into the background of my mother's expectations. Before he learned to keep the peace by keeping his mouth shut. But I reminded myself, he sat at that same dinner table. He toasted Ashley with the same champagne. He signed that deed without blinking. Silence doesn't make you innocent. Sometimes it makes you worse. Then came Ashley right on cue, voice soft and syrupy, calling under the pretense of being concerned, but sliding effortlessly into her usual script. "I don't know what's going on between you and Mom, but it's really hurting them. They're not saying anything, but I can see it. They don't have anywhere to go, Rachel. You're letting them feel abandoned." I could have screamed. I could have reminded her that she was the one who now owned the house I paid for. I could have pointed out that she hadn't contributed a single dollar, hadn't shown up for a single bill, hadn't spent a single day wondering what it feels like to carry a family on your back without once being thanked for it. But I didn't bother. I simply told her I wasn't discussing it and hung up before the conversation turned into another circus. That's what they never understood about me. I don't need to yell to say no. I don't need to fight to walk away. I just need to decide. And I'd already done that. Still, I thought the pressure would taper off eventually, that they'd get bored or move on or redirect their attention back to Ashley, where it always belonged. But instead, they escalated. I was out of town for a few days, nothing major, just a short work trip, and when I came back, my neighbor, an older man named Greg who watches everything from his porch like it's his personal stage play, waved me down before I even pulled into my driveway. "Your folks were here," he said, voice low and hesitant, like he wasn't sure if he was tattling or doing me a favor. "Couple days ago. Knocked around for a bit. Didn't look like they had keys, but they were peeking in the windows. Said they were just checking on the place for you." I thanked him, played it cool, told him it was probably just a misunderstanding, but inside, something was already twisting tight in my gut. I parked the car, walked up to the front door, and everything seemed in order at first, no broken locks, no signs of forced entry. But then I walked around to the back porch and saw something that made my heart sink just slightly into my stomach. There were footprints, fresh ones, in the soft dirt near the edge of the patio, close to the window that looked into the kitchen. And that window, the one I knew for a fact had been locked shut the last time I'd left, was cracked open just an inch. Not wide enough to climb through. Not enough to trip the alarm. But enough to unsettle me. Enough to make me pause. I stood there, staring at the window, wondering how long it had been open and what the hell they thought they were doing. And in that moment, I knew this wasn't about needing a place to stay anymore. This was about entitlement. And entitlement has a way of creeping in through windows when the doors stop opening. There comes a point in every conflict where you stop hoping for understanding and start preparing for defense, not because you want to escalate things, but because you finally understand that some people don't respect boundaries unless they come with consequences. After the incident with the open window and the footprints in the dirt, I knew I couldn't afford to keep pretending this was all just some harmless misunderstanding. Whether my parents were truly trying to test limits or were just used to slinking past them without notice, it didn't really matter anymore. The line had been crossed, and it was time to draw another one, this time with ink instead of implication. So I called a security company the very next morning. I didn't tell anyone, not even my closest friends, because this wasn't a conversation anymore. It was a quiet war, and I didn't need witnesses. I just needed evidence. I had 3 cameras installed, one above the front door, one at the back porch near the kitchen window, and one facing the driveway. Nothing flashy or invasive, just enough to see what needed to be seen. I synced everything to my phone, tested every alert, and made sure every motion sensor was dialed in tight. Then I went about my life like nothing had changed, like I hadn't just turned my safe haven into a surveillance zone. But behind the scenes, I started documenting everything, every voicemail, every text, every vague comment or half-threat they left in my inbox. I started keeping a digital log, not because I was looking for a fight, but because I knew enough to recognize what this was becoming. I knew what it looked like when people who felt entitled to your time and space began treating your boundaries like a temporary inconvenience. It starts with guilt, then it turns into gaslighting, and before you know it, you're standing in your own home wondering how many locks it takes to keep out a family that thinks ownership is just another word for access. The messages started to shift after that, subtle but unmistakable. My mother, once all sweetness and sighs, began layering her words with that syrupy tone I'd learned to decode years ago. "I just don't understand why you're so defensive, Rachel. We were only trying to help. It's not like we broke in, we were just keeping an eye on things. You've been so distant lately, and it's not like you were even using the house that much." That phrase, "just keeping an eye on things," sent a chill down my spine in a way that no threat ever could. It wasn't about concern. It was about possession. It was a subtle, calculated way of telling me that my no didn't matter, that my refusal was just a temporary hurdle to be worked around until they got what they wanted. So I stopped playing nice altogether. I called my lawyer and had a formal notice drafted, an official cease and desist order addressing trespassing, unauthorized access, and unlawful entry. I didn't care how dramatic it sounded. I didn't care if it made me the bad daughter in their eyes. I mailed it directly to them, signature required, with copies of the property deed and a written statement that made one thing unmistakably clear: this house was mine, and any further encroachment would be met with legal action, not conversation. I waited for the explosion. I expected it, even. But what I got instead was silence. No phone calls. No texts. Not even a passive-aggressive message from Ashley pretending to play peacemaker. For almost a week, it was like the entire machine had shut down, and part of me wondered if it was finally over, if I had done enough to finally get through to them. But peace, I've learned, is often just a pause before the next storm. A week later, I was standing in the kitchen pouring my morning coffee when my phone rang with an unfamiliar number. I almost let it go to voicemail, assuming it was another spam call or some contractor trying to sell me siding, but something in my gut told me to answer. "Ms. Hartley?" The voice on the other end said, calm but clipped, professional in a way that instantly set my nerves on edge. "This is Detective Carter with the County Sheriff's Department. I'm calling to inform you that your property has been reported in connection with a break-in. Are you aware your house has been broken into?" The mug nearly slipped from my hand as I stared out the window, watching the breeze ripple across the lake like nothing was wrong. And in that moment, I realized this was no longer about family drama or bruised egos. This was something else entirely. This was escalation. There's a kind of silence that hits you harder than any shouting match ever could, a stillness that settles in your chest when you open the door to your home and instantly know, without even stepping inside, that something isn't right. I remember standing there on the porch of my vacation house, keys trembling just slightly in my fingers, the lock clicking open under my hand, and feeling a tight, sour twist in my gut before I even turned the knob. The air on the other side didn't feel empty, it felt invaded. Not smashed or shattered, not broken in a way that screamed burglary, but unsettled in that eerie, unmistakable way that tells you someone's been somewhere they never should have been. I pushed the door open slowly, half expecting to find a broken window, drawers flung open, electronics missing, or some clear, obvious sign that a stranger had been through. But that wasn't what I found at all. It wasn't destruction, it was disturbance. The kind that whispers instead of shouts. The throw pillows on the couch had been rearranged, but not tossed, just slightly skewed, like someone had been lounging there. My favorite blanket, the soft gray one I always kept folded on the armrest, was draped over the back of the chair in a way I'd never leave it. A glass had been left in the sink, not dirty but not clean either. A single spoon sat next to it. The fridge door was ajar, and when I opened it fully, I found a half-empty carton of orange juice I hadn't bought and a few eggs that weren't mine sitting in the tray. Someone had been living here. Not stealing, not looting. Living. I walked room to room, my heartbeat echoing in my ears, each step confirming what I already knew. This wasn't a robbery. This was something else. In the guest bedroom, the bed had been made, but the sheets were different, slightly wrinkled in the center, not fresh out of the dryer. The curtains were drawn in a way I never left them, and the scent in the air was unfamiliar, a faint mix of perfume and detergent I didn't own. Someone had been here long enough to leave a trace without leaving a signature. Some items were missing, but not in any obvious or valuable way. A set of wine glasses from the kitchen cabinet, an old radio from the guest room, a couple of books from the shelf, all things no thief would bother with, all things that meant little unless you were trying to make a space feel like your own. But that was what shook me the most. Things hadn't been taken at random. They'd been moved, adjusted, as if someone had been trying to play house, stepping into a life that wasn't theirs and trying it on for size. Detective Carter arrived shortly after I called it in, his presence quiet and steady, his questions calm and deliberate in a way that made me feel both reassured and slightly suspicious at the same time. He moved through the house with careful eyes, noting the oddities, occasionally jotting something in a small notebook, asking me what had changed and what hadn't. But it wasn't just what he asked, it was how he asked. Subtle, probing, almost like he already had a theory in mind, but was waiting for me to say it first. "Nothing's been forced," he said eventually, running his hand along the doorframe. "No broken locks, no shattered glass. Whoever came in either had a key or knew exactly how to get in without causing a scene." I nodded, my jaw tight, eyes scanning the living room as if the answer might be sitting there in plain sight. I didn't want to say it, not yet, but I was already thinking it. My parents. Who else would have known how to slip in without tripping the security? Who else would have brought eggs and juice and rearranged furniture like they were making themselves comfortable in something they believed belonged to them? Still, there was no proof. Just a trail of unease and a gut feeling I couldn't yet back up with facts. Until Carter said something that made my skin crawl. "We found something in the fireplace," he said, motioning toward the hearth. Half-burned. Looked like a document, part of a form or letter. We couldn't get much from it, but your parents' names were visible. First and last. I stared at him, my mind already racing, trying to piece together what kind of document it could have been. A bank form? A letter? Something they didn't want me to see? Something that would have confirmed they'd been here long before the cameras went up? "I'll have our team analyze it further," Carter added, but it looks like someone tried to cover their tracks. Just not very well. I swallowed hard, unsure whether it was fear or fury rising in my chest. And just as I turned toward the hallway to grab my phone charger, I noticed something else, something that didn't belong in the bathroom trash can. It was one of my old bank statements. Torn in half, but still legible. The name at the top, my address, my account number, clear as day. I hadn't brought that document with me. I hadn't printed anything. That was from a file I kept locked at my main home. Which meant someone had taken it from there. Or had already copied it. Or worse, someone had been watching me long enough to know what mattered most. And that's when it hit me. This wasn't about a place to stay. This was about control. And someone was trying very, very hard to take back something that was never theirs to begin with. There's a moment when you stop hoping for clarity and start preparing for closure, even if it doesn't look like the version you once imagined. After the bank statement in the trash, after the half-burned document in the fireplace, after the eerie displacement of furniture and the subtle, invasive rearrangement of a home I once considered untouchable, I knew there was only one thing left to do. I needed to confront them. Not because I expected confessions or apologies or even answers, but because I wanted to look them in the eye one last time and see what kind of lies they'd wrap themselves in when cornered. I needed to feel how far they'd fall to protect their version of the truth. So I drove to their house, the same house I used to pay for, the one that now belonged to Ashley and Mark, the one my parents had once called home but now merely squatted in as guests, as dependents of their favorite child. I didn't bother to call ahead. I wasn't giving them time to rehearse their performance. I pulled into the driveway, walked up the front steps, and knocked once. It was my mother who answered, face already tight with apprehension before I even said a word. She must have known. On some level, they always know. "I want to talk," I said, voice low and flat. She stepped aside without argument, and I found my father already sitting in the living room, awkwardly pretending to read a newspaper he clearly hadn't touched in hours. I didn't waste time with pleasantries or questions. I laid it all out in one controlled breath: the break-in, the rearranged house, the missing items, the burned document, the bank statement they had no business possessing. I didn't accuse directly, not yet. I just described the facts, step by step, each detail laid like a brick on the table between us, and then I sat back and waited to see what they'd do with it. They did what they always did: deny, deflect, diminish. My mother tilted her head, feigned concern, and said things like, "That sounds terrible," and "Who would do such a thing?" and "We certainly haven't been anywhere near your place." My father nodded in agreement, murmuring the occasional, "That's just awful," while avoiding eye contact like it might set his skin on fire. I watched them carefully, measuring every pause, every twitch, every glance exchanged between them. And then, like a final nail in the coffin, Ashley went radio silent. No calls, no texts, no vague attempts to smooth things over like she usually did when my parents screwed up and she was roped into the fallout. But what she did do, whether by accident or arrogance, was post a photo on social media, a stupid little snapshot of her and Mark sitting on a porch swing, wine glasses in hand, smiling at the camera. The caption read, "Relaxing weekend getaway at the lake." Just what we needed. It was my porch swing. The photo had been taken weeks before I filed the break-in report, weeks before I even knew anything was wrong. The background was unmistakable: the lake, the railing, even the chipped corner of the siding I hadn't gotten around to repairing yet. And just like that, the mask slipped. I didn't send the photo to my parents. I didn't send a furious message to Ashley. I sent it straight to my lawyer, along with every bit of documentation I had, every camera recording, every voicemail, every trespassing notice, every receipt. I had no interest in screaming matches or emotional theater. I wanted records. I wanted legal clarity. I wanted a paper trail that could speak louder than my voice ever had. The police reviewed everything, but in the end, there were no formal charges, no locks had been broken, no property had been severely damaged, and without footage clearly showing who had entered and when. It all fell into that gray zone where family drama meets legal ambiguity. Detective Carter was sympathetic, but ultimately useless. "It's complicated," he said with a shrug, like that was some kind of comfort. "You did the right thing documenting it all, but this kind of situation rarely ends in court." But I didn't need court. What I needed was distance. And so I sold the vacation home. Quietly, efficiently, without ceremony. I signed the papers, handed over the keys, and walked away from the last place I ever truly thought of as mine. And then, because I could, I bought a new property across the country, a small home nestled against the mountains, far enough from everything familiar that the silence there actually felt earned instead of forced. A week after the sale closed, I received one final message from my mother. No apology. No admission. Just another hollow attempt at reconnection, dressed in that same fragile tone she always used when she didn't want to look like the villain. "We heard you moved. Will we see you again?" I stared at it for a long moment, thinking about all the years I spent being the reliable one, the quiet one, the daughter who said yes when she should have said no. I thought about the house I paid for but never owned, the home I protected but never truly got to keep, and the people who only called it family when they needed something. Then I deleted the message. I poured myself a glass of wine. And I sat in my new living room, watching the sun go down over a view no one else had laid claim to, wondering, not for the first time, if this was what winning felt like. Or if I'd just learned how to lose with dignity. Because sometimes peace isn't about getting justice. Sometimes it's just about getting away before the damage becomes permanent.